Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 28, River Ride. They left the inn with a parcel from Jerise for the road. The fishermen were quiet, save for the few necessary words for casting off and bringing the boat out into the river. It was a small single-decked affair with a cabin for steerage and compartments fixed into the deck along the edges. Rohamar found a quiet spot on the bow and settled himself on the deck, barely aware of Gunwald taking up station at his back. As the boat's single sail filled and it pulled away from the shore, Rohamar began to pray. In the realm of the gods, from the seclusion of her garden, Enshul watched and listened. She listened as Rohamar called for her father's power to shroud and guide them, and watched as the golden light of her father's power answered. She heard Rohamar's voice catch and glanced at the ebon wall that served as her window into the mortal world. Her observation was touched with envy as she noticed the shimmer in the Kavarag priest's eyes and saw the gratitude in his heart. Tears, she wondered, becoming sure as the first drop rolled like liquid silver down his cheek. Sadness, grief, and a little envy welled inside her. How could a servant pledged and faithful to her find such joy in the service of another? Her grief at losing him flowed into jealous anger, and she raised a fist to the wall before her. Pounding on its surface had no effect, save to make her hand ache and obscure her vision. She stopped and let her rage flow into release. His change of service hadn't been what he'd wanted either, and he had grieved her loss as much as she did his. With a murmured word, she let the release flow into blessing, and the blessing she blew like a kiss into the picture on the wall. There it mingled with her father's power, betraying itself as hers with the blue silver of its light as it came to rest on Rohamar's head. With a feeling of gentle regret, Anshul saw another lock of the beast elf's hair turn blue, and then she smiled. Let her father think on that. She turned from the scrying wall and let the picture fade to become a sheet of blue-laced nightstone once more. On the prow of the fishing boat, Rohamar felt the touch of his goddess's magic and felt a pang of wistful loss. Then he felt the strong, sure presence of his new god and knew he couldn't go back. He had a task to do, had been chosen by a new master and given over. He hoped the goddess understood. His prayers continued, mingling need with grateful thanks, and he was not disturbed. The sailors went on with the work of keeping the boat moving upstream, leaving him in peace. And when they found themselves with no other task, they cast lines from the deck to try and catch something to take back to the village. Behind him, Grunwald kept watch, observing the narrow expanse of the river's flow. He noted the push of the wind that kept them going against the current. He noted also how thickly the forest grew by the river bank where once he knew a swathe had been kept clear to enable the river to be seen from the road. Patrols were supposed to watch the western border of Toromar. He wondered how they could even reach it with all the undergrowth in the way. Maybe even the king doesn't care what happens on his own border. Perhaps he is something else watching it for him. Thinking it gave him the clue he needed to guess at what form those other guardians might take. But it was not enough to reveal them to him, no matter how carefully he scanned the ground and water around them. Afternoon had fled into dusk by the time the boat reached the river junction. Here the waters grew turbulent as the river currents met and mingled, and Alessia and Sindra hooked their arms through the rails on the outside of the steering cabin. Grunwald placed a hand between Rohamar's shoulders, steadying him as he knelt. The rough waters made it hard to see if anything was amiss within. It certainly concealed the swirl of muddied water that rose from the bottom as they passed. The sudden roar of the water as it fought and jostled for space within the river banks drowned out all other sound, and the boat struggled to make headway against it as the wind wavered and died. Pater gave Grunwald a worried look and shrugged helplessly, but Rohamar rose to his feet. "Have them turn her toward the mouth of the second river," he told Grunwald, ignoring the puzzled look the barbarian gave him. The same look crossed Pater's face when the old fisherman heard the instruction, but after glancing past Grunwald to catch the seriousness in Rohamar's eyes, he did as he was asked, shouting orders to his men. Satisfied his request was being answered, Rohamar stood in the bow and faced the waters. Reaching for Staravan's power, he prayed that the waters ahead be made smooth. Behind him, he heard the fishermen fight to turn the boat in the direction he'd requested. Beneath them, the creature swirled in confusion. Puzzled by the boat's sudden change of direction, The creature drew to the river's edge to watch from beneath an overhang in the river bank. Roma heard the tight-reined impatience in the fishermen's cries as they brought the boat to face the greatest turbulence. With a smile of triumph, he spoke the last word of the prayer and saw Staravan's power surge out across the water. The turbulence stilled, the current paused, and a gentle breeze blew to fill the vessel's sails. With the sure delicacy of a dancer treading the narrow back of a tavern's table, the fishing boat began to move along the path that stretched before her. A hushed silence fell across the men behind him, and Rama turned his head to look at them. They were so engrossed in watching him and marvelling at the path created before them that they had their backs to the sight of the water weird rising in the boat's wake. With barely a pause, Rama drew and channeled a second portion of Staravan's power. Alessia, sitting beside the cabin, saw the change in his expression and moved to see what made him look so suddenly fierce. Even from the centre of the power he'd drawn, Rama felt the tingle of magic that answered the wizardess's panicked call. The creature sensed it as well, drawing itself even higher out of the water and roaring a challenge at the boat. The fishermen ran toward the mast to loose more sail, then reached for weapons. Peter picked up a gaff hook from inside the cabin and moved purposely toward the stern, calling the youngest member of the crew to take over the steering. "Hold her path!" he roared. "We'll deal with this." "Stay where you are," Roma ordered, sending the ball of power he'd called and shaped. He watched it curve toward the weird and come to a stop above its head. Holding his breath, he waited, praying he hadn't been mistaken when he'd made the prayer that what he'd shaped in his mind would come forth in reality. Seconds later, the ball exploded, becoming a glistening veil of golden light that descended in a slow shower over the creature's skin. Alessia's spell struck it next. Her magic glowed like fire as it sailed from her fingertips over the boat's stern and across the water. It burrowed through the golden veil of Staravan's magic and embedded itself deeply into the creature's upper body. The weird screamed as Alessia's fireball exploded inside it, sending veins of gleaming orange and red radiating out from its centre. The veins traced their way through every portion of the creature he could see and then began to widen. The weird roared again in a higher note pitched for agony, and its body thrashed around in the water. The orange light of the still forming veins spread until nothing of the weird's original colour was left. The creature melted, not disappearing, but spreading over the water's turgid surface until it ran like an oil slick on its top. The fishermen stared at it in silence, horror evident in their expressions. Alessia closed her eyes to the sight of its remains and slid down the side of the steering cabin. Peter carefully replaced the gaff hook inside a chest bolted in the cabin and retook the wheel. Rama relaxed his stance in the bow of the boat and let the boat clear the junction before releasing the spell that kept the waters calm. As the tumbled roar of joining rivers rose behind the boat, he went and sat beside the wizardess, watching the river bank slide by. This river was narrower than the one that ran to Wildergen. It was colder as well. Mist rose from its water, lending a chill to the air. As Roma settled beside Alessia, Brianda uncoiled from a niche between two boxes. She tucked herself between them to take herself out of the sailor's way, and remained still during their battle with the weird. Now she raised her head and scanned the trees overhanging the river. To Roma it looked like she was measuring how far they reached, but she didn't explain her interest. Without a word to him or anyone else, she drew a bow from her bundle of belongings, strung it, and took the quiver of arrows that had lain beside it. Roma wondered where she'd gotten it. They had just visited a town full of hunters, and Falcon had kept a close eye on her during their travels. Slinging the quiver and gripping the bow in one hand, Brianda stepped into the walkway and moved around the cabin. Roma watched her leave, then settled beside Alessia. She's right, he thought. Someone should take the watch. Alessia trembled beside him, and he looked down at her. She was pale-faced and tight-lipped, her eyes wide and dark with distress. "Easy, Mouse," he murmured, sliding a hand behind her back and drawing her beneath his cloak. He stopped when she tensed. Then she relaxed and helped him draw the cloak around her. When she'd settled against his side, he relaxed also, keeping his arm where it was. "Well, Mouse," he said softly, "do you mind if I grant you a little healing?" Alessia shook her head, drawing his arm and his cloak more firmly about her. "It's not healing I require," she replied, a little warmth and rest, and some of your strength if you can give it." "Some strength I can grant," Roma answered, "but as to whether it's my own or Staravan's, I cannot say." "Either will do," Alessia murmured. "It doesn't matter, as long as it can be spared." "Very well," Roma agreed, murmuring the prayer that would shape Staravan's power to her need. At the end of the cabin, Brianda looked around at the river banks. A small stir of movement beside her disturbed her concentration, and she glanced down. Ghost's mottled face looked up at her, her amber eyes demanding permission. Brianda sighed. "All right," she told the child. "You can come with me if you wish." "I was going to," the girl retorted, "whether you wanted me to or not." Brianda grimaced and jerked her chin toward the cabin roof, and Ghost nodded. "It's a good choice," Ghost agreed, and they walked around the cabin until they found a storage cabinet attached to the outside. Again the pair exchanged glances, then Brianda nodded and Ghost scampered onto the cabinet and up onto the flat expanse of the cabin roof. Brianda followed, careful not to catch her bow or quiver on the overhang. By the time she'd reached the roof, Ghost was already lying on her belly and scanning the river banks ahead. Brianda looked at the child and frowned. What is she searching for? She wondered, noting the intensity of the youngster's concentration. What could she possibly hope to see that I couldn't? The intentness of Ghost's gaze didn't diminish, nor did her concentration falter as the fishing boat continued further up the river. Brianda crouched quietly beside the child and did her own scanning as the afternoon deepened into dusk and the dusk deepened into night. The fishing vessel reached the crossroads as dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. Pater moved to the bow, relinquishing the steering to his first mate and calling for the boat to be turned to shore. Glancing up at the steering cabin's roof, he was surprised to see the smaller of the two figures still upright. He shook his head. They'd been up there all night. As he watched, he saw the small figure turn and shake the other curled form sleeping beside it. Pater relaxed. At least one of them was human to need sleep. At least one of them was human enough to need sleep. He saw the second figure stir and slowly sit up, reaching instinctively for her bow, and heard the younger one calm her. "Relax, Bree," Ghost said. "We're there." As the fishing captain returned his attention to guiding the boat back to shore, Brianda rubbed the sleep from her eyes and looked around. The boat was almost at the bank, and the fishermen worked to draw it side on to the shore. One of the men secured the boat as she came alongside, his clothes wet from the swim, but he gave her a grin and a cheery wave as he fielded another rope thrown from the deck. Brianda waved back, then clambered down from her perch. The closer she got to the waterline, the colder it became, and she couldn't understand how the sailor could be so carefree when her teeth chattered in the morning mist, even though she was dry. "Roma said a prayer to warm him," Ghost explained, seeing her confusion. "He thinks it's a fine thing to be as wet as he is and still warm." Brianda snorted and moved to stand close to where Roma was waking Alessia and Sindra by the cabin wall. "A fine thing indeed," she muttered, as the cold ate past her skin and into her muscles. "Is there anything you need, Master?" Ghost asked, and Roma shook his head. "No, little one. You stay with Brianda, and I'll call you if I need you." Ghost gave a jubilant skip and returned to Brianda's side. As the boat was drawn into position, Brianda moved to the rail, balancing there until the river closed the distance between the boat and the bank. From there it was a simple matter to step nimbly over the narrowed chasm to the shore. Ghost didn't wait. She scrambled to the top of the rail and rode it as easily as she had ridden the cabin's roof. Then she leapt nimbly to the grassy bank. The fisherman on the bank grinned at them. "Lovely morning for a swim," he said, spreading his arms and offering Brianda a hug. "Lovely," Brianda agreed, walking a wide circle around him. His grin stretched, but he didn't move toward her, instead securing the line and crossing to where a narrow gangplank had been set against the shore. Brianda watched as he moved lightly across it and assisted Alessia and Sindra to debark. Others watched also, though from a distance greater than the nearby trees.